January 1987, Heathrow Airport, London. A 39-year-old Belfast man walks through arrivals, back from a year laying floors in West Germany. Waiting for him are officers from the British Army's Force Research Unit and representatives of MI5. The Army's proposal is blunt. It wants to send Brian Nelson back into the Ulster Defence Association, the largest loyalist paramilitary organisation in Northern Ireland, with instructions to work his way into its intelligence structure. MI5 and the Royal Ulster Constabulary's special branch oppose the idea. They already run loyalist agents, they argue. Another one is a risk. The Force Research Unit's position prevails. Senior Army officers, including the Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence and the Commander Land Forces, Major General Jeapes, formally authorise the re-recruitment. That decision placed a British Army agent at the heart of a loyalist killing machine, with the explicit task of centralising its targeting. Nelson was no naive volunteer. He was a former soldier of the Black Watch. He was a convicted loyalist with a serious sectarian crime on his record. And he had already worked for the FRU once before, as the exception to the unit's policy of not recruiting loyalists, before moving to Germany in 1985. Over the next 3 years, until his arrest in January 1990, Nelson ran the UDA's intelligence operation in West Belfast. He decided who got targeted and why. The Ministry of Defence paid him £46,428 over that period. And some of what went into his files, the official reviews that followed admitted, didn't come from loyalist street-level intelligence. It came from the records of the state. One of the men whose file Nelson helped assemble was a Belfast solicitor named Pat Finucane. On 12th of February 1989, Finucane was shot dead in front of his wife and 3 children. This is the story of the agent Britain sent inside and the accounting that remains open. Brian Nelson was born on the 30th of September 1947 on Belfast's Shankill Road, one of 6 children of Adam Nelson, a shipyard worker, and his wife Maisie. The family lived on Crosby Street, in the heart of loyalist West Belfast. Nelson left school at 15, walked out of the joinery apprenticeship his father had arranged after 15 months, and joined the Black Watch as a teenager. He served with the regiment's 1st Battalion in Germany and Cyprus, and was medically discharged in early 1970. The details that survive from his army years aren't flattering. Contemporaries interviewed by the journalist Greg Harkin described a disobedient, rebellious recruit who made sectarian comments and was repeatedly punished for disciplinary offences. Back in Belfast, Nelson married his wife Jean, started a family, and drove for a living. In 1972, he joined the Ulster Defence Association. The UDA was the province's largest loyalist organisation, a legal mass movement on paper with a paramilitary structure underneath and a killing arm that used the name Ulster Freedom Fighters. Until it was proscribed in 1992, it operated with a kind of semi-public existence. On the night of the 25th of March 1973, Nelson and another loyalist kidnapped Gerald Higgins, a partially sighted Catholic man in North Belfast. Higgins was taken to a loyalist club, the kind of place the UDA called a romper room, where he was beaten and tortured. Nelson supervised. He held lit cigarettes to Higgins's skin. Higgins was forced to grip live electrical wires with wet hands. The intention, apparently, was to kill him. As Nelson and 2 accomplices removed him from the club, Higgins struggled, attracted the attention of an army patrol, and the loyalists were arrested. Higgins survived. In February 1974, Nelson pleaded guilty to firearms offences, intimidation, and assault occasioning actual bodily harm. The conspiracy to murder charge was dropped in a plea bargain. He was sentenced to 7 years and served about 4 in the UDA compound at Long Kesh, released in August 1977. That plea bargain has drawn speculation ever since. Some have wondered whether Nelson was already working for the security forces in 1974. The official record denies it. His first documented recruitment by military intelligence came a decade later. Back inside the UDA, Nelson drifted toward intelligence work. He used his trade as a carpet fitter to move through nationalist areas, gathering information. He was quiet, relatively abstemious, and physically nondescript. Loyalists nicknamed him the Secret Squirrel. His own description of the work, written after his arrest, is more revealing. Pitting your wits against those you seek to compromise acts like a drug. The more you experience it, the more you want it, regardless of the moments of intense fear. In May 1984, working as a skip lorry driver, Nelson contacted the British Army and offered to spy on the UDA. His stated motivation survives in his FRU case file, quoted in the 2012 De Silva Review. In the early days, the UDA was a necessary organisation, but it had grown evil and was behind more of the criminal activities in Protestant areas. Between May 1984 and October 1985, Nelson met his handlers about 60 times and was paid just over £2,000. Official reviews record that in this first stint, he played a pivotal role in the targeting and attempted murder of a Sinn Féin councillor. Then he moved his family to West Germany for construction work, and the relationship went quiet. Regular viewers of this channel have met the Force Research Unit before, in our earlier film on the British Army unit that ran the IRA. The short version. Established around 1980, the FRU was a covert military intelligence unit whose job was to recruit and run agents inside paramilitary organisations. At its late 1980s peak, it had up to 80 officers and about 100 additional staff, spread across 4 regional detachments and headquarters at Lisburn. Its operators were trained by 14 Intelligence and the SAS. The unit motto was "Fishers of Men." Nelson was run from FRU's East Detachment at Palace Barracks, which covered Greater Belfast. His code number, 6137, marked him as an East Detachment asset. Over his informer career, he had around 10 handlers, an unusually high number. In the key 1987 to 1989 period, they included an officer codenamed A/02 and, from April 1989, Colour Sergeant A/10. One account identifies Margaret Walshaw as his primary handler for much of this period. A 2000 interview with a former FRU operator accused Walshaw of sourcing maps, photos, and personal details of people to be targeted, and of buying Nelson a personal computer so information could be passed to him on floppy disks. In January 1987, under a new commander, Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Kerr, a former Gordon Highlander from Aberdeen, the FRU reviewed its coverage of loyalist paramilitaries and identified a gap. It examined Nelson's case, consulted MI5, and began the process of bringing him back from Germany. The opposition was real. MI5 believed Special Branch already had enough loyalist agents. RUC Special Branch agreed. The FRU's position prevailed, and the re-recruitment was formally sanctioned by senior army officers. The decision to put Nelson back inside the UDA was deliberate, approved, and known at the highest levels of military intelligence in Northern Ireland. Kerr's own reasoning is on the record. He told the Stevens inquiry that the UDA was carrying out assassinations on a seemingly ad hoc basis. and that the FRU wanted to persuade the UDA to centralise their targeting through Nelson and to concentrate their targeting on known PIRA activists. At Nelson's trial in 1992, Kerr, appearing under the pseudonym Colonel J, put the broader logic this way. In order to gain inside knowledge, which we desperately need of the terrorist organisations, in order that we can save life, that we can prevent attacks taking place, that we can prevent assassinations, that we can make arrests, that we can get recoveries of weapons and explosives, you must have an agent who is in a terrorist organisation. Nelson was paid £200 a week. The FRU also provided him with the addresses of 3 alleged IRA suspects the UDA was planning to kill. By 21 May 1987, a diplomatic note recorded that Nelson is now established in UDA HQ. The relationship ran on face-to-face meetings, usually weekly, tape-recorded and transcribed onto what the FRU called contact forms. The contact forms for 6137 read today like a record of an operation that slipped its leash. In November 1987, once all the information has been gathered and checked by 6137, it will be passed on to the various UFF commanders for action. In April 1988, Nelson wants the UDA to attack legitimate targets, which means proper planning and targeting must be done. This hasn't happened in the past and is only just beginning to happen with 6137 in his current position as intelligence officer. In May 1988, 6137 wants the UDA only to attack legitimate targets and not innocent Catholics. In August 1988, 6137's appointment enables him to make sure proper targeting of PIRA members takes place prior to any shooting. And in February 1989, 11 days before Pat Finucane was shot dead, 6137 initiates most of the targeting of late. He is currently running an operation against selected Republican personalities. An internal assessment noted the result with satisfaction. The level of targeting information is already of a high quality, and recent attacks have proven this accurate. And the targeting has developed and is now more professional. The professionalization is measurable. Between 1980 and 1986, the UDA killed 17 people, an average of about 2.8 a year. Between 1987 and 1989, with Nelson running intelligence, it killed 25, more than 8 a year. The operation to make the UDA more discriminating had coincided with the UDA becoming more deadly. The question at the centre of this story is where the intelligence actually came from. Before Nelson, much loyalist targeting was genuinely ad hoc. The UDA killed Catholics because they were Catholics, or because a gunman had a grievance, or because an opportunity opened up. What the organisation lacked was a system for selecting, tracking and pursuing specific individuals. Nelson built that system. He collated material into personality files and index cards in his own handwriting. He photographed targets, mapped their routines and logged their vehicles. He worked alongside the West Belfast UDA leadership and helped move the organisation's records onto computers, a change that made the files easier to use and, after his arrest, impossible to confiscate all at once. The material was still being used by loyalists after he was jailed in 1990. And he circulated the results. Nelson copied his files across to both the UDA and the Ulster Volunteer Force. His handlers knew. No serious attempt to stop it appears in the record. To understand how dangerous this system was, trace one piece of intelligence from origin to impact. The chain is the story. Origin. The Royal Ulster Constabulary and the British Army both kept files on known and suspected Republicans. Personality cards, known as P cards, recording an individual's movements, vehicles, associations, and suspected IRA connections. Enough detail to plan an assassination. The Gardaí in the Republic of Ireland had their own records: military maps, vehicle registration data, and surveillance photographs, all sat inside state systems. This was the raw material. Leak. Some of that material reached loyalists through serving or former members of the UDA and the RUC. The scale of the leakage wasn't a secret. An internal army assessment in 1973 had already described the UDA as the best single source of weapons and the only significant source of modern weapons for Protestant extremist groups. When Stevens' investigators eventually tallied what had been passed across, they recovered around 2,600 security force documents that had reached loyalist hands. Collection. Nelson gathered the leaked material and integrated it into UDA files. In October 1987, he handed an intelligence dump to his FRU handlers. A FRU file note itemized the contents: 500 A4 RUCP file cards, RUC statements, Garda reports, British Army P card files, military maps, photographs of suspects in police custody, electoral rolls. Intervention. This is the step that makes the Nelson case different from a simple leak. The material didn't flow one way, from the street to the state. It flowed back. According to Nelson's prison journal, reported by BBC Panorama in 1992, military intelligence took a bin liner full of documents that had been leaked by UDR and RUC personnel, weeded out the outdated target details, and returned a more selective list to Nelson for use by loyalists. RUC P cards were cycled through the FRU, updated with further state intelligence, and handed back into UDA targeting packs. In at least one operation recorded by the De Silva Review, FRU handlers deliberately provided Nelson with targeting information, including surveillance photographs of a suspect's home that Nelson could present to his UDA superiors to cement his position. The state wasn't passively aware of the leaks. In specific documented instances, it fed the machine. Dissemination. Nelson distributed the refined material to UDA units and to the UVF. The FRU's own November 1987 contact form says it plainly. Once all the information has been gathered and checked by 6137, it will be passed on to the various UFF commanders for action. Impact. People died. Stevens' investigators found index cards in Nelson's handwriting on 369 individuals. At least 80 people listed on his targeting files were attacked. 29 were shot dead. Stevens' third report implicates Nelson in 15 murders, 14 attempted murders, and 62 conspiracies to murder. Some of the dead had IRA connections. Others died through mistaken identity. Some were selected at random. The scale of state-derived material in the system is the central fact. MI5 itself assessed in 1985 that approximately 85% of the intelligence the UDA used to select targets for murder came from state security force sources, the army and the police. The De Silva Review records 270 separate instances between January 1987 and September 1989 in which security force information was passed to loyalist paramilitaries, whether as documents or as verbal targeting details like vehicle registration checks. The 85% figure is the single most damning statistic in the entire file, and it comes from the state's own assessment of its own leaks. At every stage of that chain, there was a point where someone could have intervened. when a UDR soldier leaked a file, when the FRU seized a bin liner and chose which names to send back, when Nelson reported a target to his handler. The record shows state agencies had foreknowledge of many of Nelson's operations and intervened in only a small number of cases. How small is the question. According to leaked FRU documents published in 1998, Army intelligence knew the identity of intended UDA victims on at least 92 occasions. Information was used to prevent killings in 2 cases, one being an attempt on Gerry Adams. The most thorough later review, Operation Kenova, reached a similar ratio. 2 clear examples of lives saved against roughly 30 murders that should have been prevented. Those figures come from different sources, compiled years apart, and they converge. The word that keeps appearing in the FRU's own paperwork is legitimate. Nelson wanted the UDA to attack legitimate targets. The FRU wanted it to avoid innocent Catholics. But once the machine was built, the definition of legitimate was set by the UDA. Some of the people in Nelson's files were IRA members or Republicans. Others died on the basis of mistaken identity. Some were selected at random or because a loyalist leader carried a grudge. The clearest case in the whole file became a murder. Patrick Finucane was a Belfast solicitor who represented Republican clients. On Sunday the 12th of February 1989, he sat down for dinner in his North Belfast home with his wife Geraldine and their 3 children. 2 masked UDA gunmen came through the door and shot him dead. Geraldine was struck and survived by pressing herself to the floor. The children saw it. Nelson's role in that murder was specific and mechanical. The De Silva Review records that Nelson, as an army agent tasked with making loyalist targeting more professional, supplied one of Finucane's killers with a photograph of Finucane and pointed out his home. He didn't fire the shots. According to Nelson's prison journal, he had been asked to gather information about Finucane weeks before the killing, had informed his handlers of the request, and had passed the photograph to a UDA man, named in the journal as Eric McKee, identified elsewhere as Ernie McKee, a few days before the attack. Loyalist sources claimed Nelson reconnoitred the Finucane home with the killers beforehand. There were 3 state agents woven into this one murder. Nelson, the FRU's man inside the UDA's intelligence structure. William Stobie, the UDA quartermaster, who was simultaneously an RUC Special Branch agent. And Ken Barrett, the UDA member who pleaded guilty to the killing in 2004. After, according to the official record, being recruited as an agent rather than arrested for the murder when Stevens investigators first closed in. The warnings existed. De Silva found that MI5 received intelligence 2 months before the murder that Finucane was under threat. RUC Special Branch had been warned on multiple occasions, including roughly 7 weeks before the killing, that a hit on a top IRA man, understood by some agents to refer to Finucane, was imminent. No effective protective measures were taken. Finucane wasn't warned. The British government's own review, published in December 2012, concluded that FRU must bear a degree of responsibility for Brian Nelson's targeting activity during 1987 to 89, including that of Patrick Finucane. The then Prime Minister, David Cameron, accepted that there had been shocking levels of state collusion. One precise hedge matters here. De Silva found no evidence of an overarching state conspiracy directed by government ministers. The murder wasn't proven to be a policy decision taken in Whitehall. The finding is narrower and in some ways harder to answer. Employees of the state actively furthered the murder, and state agencies with warning of it failed to act. The distinction between collusion and conspiracy is the line the entire Nelson case runs along. Nelson's run ended not because his handlers stopped him, but because an inquiry caught up with him. In September 1989, following the murder of a Catholic man named Lachlan McGinn, described by the security forces as purely sectarian, the RUC's Chief Constable called in John Stevens, Deputy Chief Constable of Cambridgeshire, to investigate collusion between the security forces and loyalist paramilitaries. Stevens' team found UDA intelligence material that appeared to come from state files. Nelson's fingerprints were on the documents. On the 10th January 1990, the day scheduled for his arrest, the Stevens Inquiry's incident room at Carrickfergus RUC headquarters burned down. The fire destroyed evidence. Arson was widely suspected. According to the Dictionary of Irish Biography, Nelson's handlers took him and his files to Liverpool that same day. A week later, he returned to Northern Ireland, was arrested, and immediately admitted being an agent of military intelligence. He was initially charged with possession of information likely to be useful to terrorists and remanded to Crumlin Road Prison. By May 1991, he faced 35 charges in total, including 2 counts of murder, 5 counts of conspiracy to murder, and numerous lesser offences. On the 22nd of January 1992, Nelson appeared at Belfast Crown Court and pleaded guilty to 20 charges. 5 counts of conspiracy to murder, 14 counts of possessing information likely to be useful to terrorists, 1 count of possessing a submachine gun. The 15 other charges, including both murder counts, weren't proceeded with and remained on the file. The distinction matters, and it's the reason this story is titled the way it's time. Nelson wasn't charged with pulling a trigger. He was charged with conspiring to murder, agreeing that people should die, and supplying the intelligence that made their deaths possible. Pat Finucane's name wasn't among the counts. No charge relating to his murder was ever brought. On the 3rd of February 1992, Lord Justice Kelly sentenced him. The judge calculated that the total of all sentences would have reached 101 years if served consecutively. Instead, he ordered them to run concurrently. Effective sentence, 10 years. Kelly then described Nelson as a man of the greatest courage, who had crossed the dividing line between criminal participation and lawful intelligence gathering. That line, the judge's own words, is the whole controversy compressed into a sentence. The state's position was that Nelson's criminal activity was the price of intelligence. The counterposition, documented in the years that followed, is that the intelligence operation itself produced murders that could have been prevented. The plea deal attracted immediate suspicion. The Attorney General's office had taken direct control of the prosecution. Nelson wasn't used as a witness against UDA leaders because, as the Dictionary of Irish Biography notes, of fear of what might emerge in cross-examination. His guilty plea meant the full evidence of what he had done and what his handlers had known was never tested in open court. The countercase deserves its hearing. At sentencing, Colonel Kerr testified that Nelson's intelligence had saved around 200 lives, including preventing a planned UDA assassination of Gerry Adams using a limpet mine attached to his car. Kerr said Nelson had warned of 730 possible threats against 217 individuals. The Gerry Adams case is documented. Nelson learned of the plan in early 1987, informed his handlers, an undercover army unit intervened, and the UDA team aborted. The later official reviews took a different measure. Operation Canova and Stevens 3 concluded that FRU had significantly exaggerated the number of lives Nelson saved, finding only 2 clear examples against roughly 30 murders that should have been prevented. De Silva's review suggested around 3 lives saved. So the honest summary of Nelson's tenure is a balance sheet with 2 columns. A handful of lives genuinely saved, including one of the most senior Republican figures in the province, and a targeting system fed by state records that coincided with a near tripling of the UDA's kill rate and left scores of names on index cards that outlived his arrest. Nelson served roughly half his 10-year sentence and was released in the mid-1990s, relocated under a new identity. The inquiries kept coming. Stevens 1 had established his dual role and put him in prison. Stevens 2 examined his case. Stevens 3, published on the 17th April 2003, concluded that collusion had been much more widespread than first believed, that evidence had been withheld, and that it ranged to the extreme of agents being involved in murder. 6 days before that report was published, Brian Nelson was dead. He died on the 11th April 2003, aged 55, from a brain hemorrhage in Cardiff, Wales. 2 weeks earlier, he had suffered a heart attack. He was ill with cancer and a heavy smoker. Some early reports placed his death in Canada. The Kane archive still records it that way. But the corrected account, followed by the Dictionary of Irish Biography and The Guardian, places him in Cardiff. Stevens' own words about the obstruction he faced were reported to Parliament in May 2003. On the intelligence dump Nelson had handed over in 1987. This had been seized by his FRU handlers when my first inquiry had begun in September 1989. This crucial evidence had been concealed from my inquiry team, and on the documents he had asked for years earlier. During my first inquiry, I asked to examine particular documents, but received written statements that they didn't exist. My latest inquiry team has now recovered all these documents. The dates recorded on them show that they all existed at the time of my first request. The files that were finally recovered showed signs of having been worked on. Powerbase, summarising the record, reported that intelligence files on Nelson were removed from Army headquarters after Stevens' appointment and weren't turned over until August 1990, and that forensic tests showed most of the files had been altered. In December 2012, the De Silva Review added its own findings. Nelson, it concluded, had played some part in at least 4 murders, 10 attempted murders, and numerous conspiracies to murder, and his collation and dissemination of targeting material likely had a broader and more deadly impact that is difficult to quantify. The review also criticised the Ministry of Defence for advice that, in De Silva's account, portrayed Nelson as Mother Teresa. Then, the accountability question. On the 25th of June 2007, the Director of Public Prosecutions for Northern Ireland issued a statement. There was insufficient evidence to prosecute any FRU member for conspiracy to murder in connection with Nelson's conspiracies. The DPP confirmed that Stevens had investigated whether FRU personnel were party to the conspiracies to murder to which Nelson pleaded guilty, and concluded there was insufficient admissible evidence to establish an agreement. Papers concerning Brigadier Gordon Kerr and other FRU officers were prepared. No FRU handler was ever charged. No FRU handler was ever tried. That is the gap the inquiries couldn't close. Not because the behaviour was disputed. Stevens found collusion. De Silva found state employees actively furthered Finucane's murder. The British government apologised. But because the legal threshold couldn't be met. And the person who might have helped meet it was gone. Brian Nelson pled guilty to 5 counts of conspiracy to murder. He served less than half his sentence. He died in 2003, before the public inquiry into Pat Finucane's murder, ordered only in 2024, ever got to compel his testimony. The question that inquiry would have put to him is still open. Of everyone whose file crossed his desk, the 369 names on his index cards, the 80 people attacked, the 29 shot dead, how many could his handlers have warned and chose instead to let the UDA find on its own? The record supports a precise answer, not a sweeping one. State agencies knew of many operations. They intervened in a handful of cases. The official reviews found 2 clear examples of lives saved and 30 murders that should have been prevented. The full ledger has never been produced because the files that would complete it were concealed, altered, or destroyed before the investigators who asked for them got to see them. Nelson took the choices he was sent in to take. The choices his handlers made on the other end of the phone were buried with the paperwork, and with him.